Invasion of the Dinosaurs is honestly a pretty enjoyable episode. The first part of this story is particularly entertaining as we see the Doctor and Sarah Jane make their way about the barren streets of London. It's a cool way to set up this story, and it is well justified why the streets are empty.
Dearie me, that's very antiquated equipment, isn't it? I think I'll find that the right is my best side.
Shut up and hold that in front of you.
Oh, all right.
It doesn't take long before we encounter the dinosaurs of the serial, and if I'm being honest, they worked decently for me. Simply because of what I had heard about the effects in this episode, I was expecting them to look quite bad, but if I'm being honest, I thought they were pretty on par with Classic Who's standards. Now don't get me wrong, they didn't look great, and at times they looked really bad, but it was as passable as the effects in this show have always been. Either you get on board with it and enjoy the story, or you can't, which is perfectly fine. This is the second story in which Sarah Jane and the Doctor are together, and I really do enjoy this duo. They have a reasonable amount of fun together, and it makes for an enjoyable on-screen dynamic.
No, it doesn't work.
Probably been vandalized.
That's a very unfair word, you know. Because actually the Vandals were quite decent chaps.
Which is why I actually wish there was more of that within this story. Some of the events within the serial lead to the separation of these two characters for a significant portion of it, which also means that when the story isn't engaging you as a viewer, it can't fall back on that dynamic to support it. Which is unfortunate, as there are parts within this that I found not terribly interesting. Also, though I am liking Sarah Jane, there are a couple of points in the story where she doesn't totally work. The serial calls for her to make some poor choices for the sake of cliffhangers, and I didn't really appreciate that. For the most part though, Elizabeth Sladen lands what she's going for and does some good work. It's just a little bit mixed on the whole.
Brigadier.
Do you think you're doing, Doctor?
The Brigadier does work pretty well for me in this. I think I've largely come to enjoy the character, even if it did take some time for him to grow on me. Nicholas Courtney does well in the part, and he has a nice role within this overall serial.
We'll need some rope and a strong net.
You intend to catch it?
Yes, of course. I want to observe it under laboratory conditions. Have you got any rope?
We've got some towing rope, sir.
You're going to tie it up?
That's my intention, yes.
All right, Corporal, carry on.
Now, this was actually one of the few ones that my family owned on DVD, which meant that I had the choice between watching the black and white version or the recolorized first episode, because I guess the original prints for episode 1 were lost or something. Whoops. And yeah, I made the mistake of watching the recolorized version of this, and it was very distracting. I do appreciate that an effort was made to release this episode closer to its originally intended format, but I gotta be honest, it just didn't look that great in the end. In terms of pacing, this story could have been handled better. It is 6 parts long, and it really shows at times. This story has quite a few elements, and not all of them worked. I think if it had just been trimmed down, then it could have been more successful as perhaps a 4-part story. And just to be clear, the second half of this one was far less interesting than the first half. It was still enjoyable, but the actual story wasn't able to carry the same momentum for a full 6 parts. Another thing I wasn't fond of was the use of Mike Yates in this one. Unfortunately, this is an aspect of the episode that I can't say much about without diving into spoilers, which is what I will have to do now. So if you haven't seen Invasion of the Dinosaurs, then skip the time shown on the screen, but if you have seen it, then we will continue discussing this episode. I felt that Mike Yates working against the Doctor was a bit forced. It wasn't an outright horrible decision, and certainly could have been handled more poorly than it was, but it really wasn't an aspect of the story that I enjoyed. I mean, Yates worked alongside Unit for so long that to see him betray the Doctor like this does feel unearned. And in addition to that, it just wasn't fun at all to see him working against our protagonists. I get why this decision might have been made, but ultimately I was really not fond of it and didn't think it added to the serial.
Roll back time. Can Whittaker really do that?
I believe so. All the preliminary experiments have been successful.
Do you realize what will happen if they succeed?
We shall find ourselves in the golden age.
There never was a golden age, Mike. It's all an illusion.
I'm not out here saying, oh, this is the worst thing the show has done, it's absolutely horrendous. It's not really. I'm just not particularly fond of it, and I don't think it actually fits within what was already set up in this show. So not only does it not work on its own right within what's been done in the show, but I also just don't appreciate them doing that with the character. It's not that he was even one of the best unit characters, like, he wasn't. I just happened to not be a fan of seeing him portrayed in this way. There are some elements that don't particularly work for me. For one, there is a character in here that is so obviously a villain in every single possible way, but the story waits quite a bit before it lets you in on the fact that they are actually working against our heroes, and it's dreadfully unsurprising. And worse than that, because I can live with something that's not surprising, the character himself just isn't very interesting. And actually, this actor goes on to play another villain, which is much better known in Classic Who. And when we get to that episode later this year, oh my god, I will have so much to say because yikes. There was honestly a really cool and interesting part of this story when we find out that Sarah Jane was on a spaceship, but she actually wasn't on a spaceship. It was really one of the more intriguing parts of this whole serial, and it worked pretty well for me. Sarah Jane does a pretty good job of standing up against these people on her own, and she doesn't really have a lot of screaming moments, and I think that actually helped. So that stuff wasn't amazing, it didn't make the story all that much better, but I did find it pretty interesting. Even though it's in the second half of the story when it's starting to lose momentum, that is one of the things that I did enjoy.
Planet? Spaceship? What are you talking about?
We left Earth 3 months ago.
So the resolution of this story is really bizarre. The way it's shown on screen is just really cheap, and it's the kind of thing where it really felt like they were done writing the story and they just had to actually resolve it. So they just kind of fudged their way through the final few minutes, and ultimately it is kind of ridiculous, and it did take me out of this whole serial for a bit. Now, I don't presume to know the intentions of the writers or their headspace when creating this narrative, but I do have to say that the bizarreness of the way this thing concludes just feels like something that was rushed, where you got to a certain point when writing a story and you just didn't know what else to do with it.
Well, where have they gone?
Back to that golden age?
I still don't understand.
Because I can't imagine that this was something that was planned out that way, where, oh yes, this is the point, we're going to leave the story, and this is how the whole thing will conclude. It absolutely does not feel like that, and even if it was, regardless, it just doesn't fit within everything else that's going on. It doesn't totally make sense when you actually think about it, which is kind of a shame.
Was time reversed, or wasn't it?
It was for the world outside the force field. Your time was just frozen for a few seconds.
But what about you? Oh, no, don't tell me. You're a Time Lord.
Quite.
I still don't understand.
Overall, this is a really enjoyable story. The majority of it is fun and engaging, even if it does stumble at a couple of places, specifically in the final part. I did enjoy some of what was done with Sarah Jane, even if it was ultimately a little bit mixed on the whole. I liked the Doctor a good amount, and it's nice to see that I am largely coming around on the Brigadier, because there have been points when the character just hasn't worked for me, so I'm happy to be enjoying him. Some questionable choices were made with Mike Yates, and the villain in this one isn't great, but the good stuff definitely outweighs the bad and makes for quite a fun and enjoyable story, even if it slightly outstays its welcome. This one was definitely worth my time, and I'm going to give Invasion of the Dinosaurs a rating of 7.5 out of 10. If you join me this coming Sunday, then I'll be bringing you a review of Death of the Daleks, a serial that I have already seen. And whatever you think about Invasion of the Dinosaurs, whether you agree with me or you disagree with me, I would love to know your thoughts down below if you feel like sharing. And with that said, I do hope to see you around this upcoming Sunday for the review of Death to the Daleks. But if not, that is absolutely fine, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching. Take care and have a lovely week.